Story 1. My uncle had a secret family in the 1960s. He was about to deploy to Vietnam, and my grandmother held prejudiced views. He met a woman of Mexican descent on base. They got married, and she became pregnant. He went to Vietnam, and she divorced him while he was away because she could not handle the separation. He signed up for another tour of duty afterward because he was heartbroken. When he returned, she had remarried and was raising their child with her new husband. The child had never known him, and everyone seemed happy, so he walked away. He told no one. Then in 2017, when he was in his 70s on his third marriage, fourth if you count the secret one, and his last adult child had moved out, a middle-aged woman of Mexican descent showed up at his front door and said, "Hey, I think you're my dad." This happened during a family barbecue. My uncle looked at her for a moment and asked, "Maria?" She replied, "That's me." He said, "Come on out back. The dogs are already on the grill." That is how I met my much older cousin, whom I didn't know existed. Her parents, who raised her, had both passed away a couple of years earlier. On her deathbed, her mother said, "So your dad wasn't actually the man who raised you." It took her a couple of years to decide to seek him out. Her only question was, "Why didn't you ever come around?" He shrugged and replied, "Your mother told me not to, and you had a good family. Why would I ruin that?" She now lives next door to him. Story 2. My great-grandmother had a tumultuous affair with her nephew, became pregnant, had a miscarriage, and they buried the fetus in a shoebox in the park. She confessed this to my mother on her deathbed, and my mother told me when I was an adult. Story 3. This was never a secret, but I learned at my grandfather's funeral that he won a Pulitzer Prize. It was from 31 years before I was born, so by the time I came along, it was old news, and everyone was tired of hearing about it. He was always very humble about his career. Story 4. My grandma immigrated to the United States from the Philippines and brought my mom and uncle with her. I found out there was a third child who she left behind. To this day, no one knows why, and my grandma kept the reason to herself. He found us all on Facebook about 15 years ago, and it must be challenging for him. Growing up in abject poverty, knowing your mom abandoned you, and then discovering the rest of your family all living well in America. Story 5. I was in 5th grade when my parents were fighting. My dad revealed a family secret. My mom's first sexual experience was a rape, resulting in a pregnancy, and I have an older brother because her parents did not believe her and sent her to a place to have the baby. My mom responded by saying that my dad had been married twice before her and had 2 daughters from his first marriage, whom he never saw again. When I refused to go to school until I learned the details, my mom sat me down and told me everything, including all the affairs my dad had, some of which she caught him in while I was a toddler. Story 6. I discovered 2 years ago, at the age of 34, that my father had a secret family and I have an older half-sister. I also learned that he attempted to name me after her, using her exact first and middle name before I was born. He strongly advocated for this name, and it was their initial plan. Fortunately, my mother changed her mind at the last minute for an unknown reason. Story 7. My dad died in a car accident. I found out as an adult that he was in the car with a cocktail waitress who had been drinking. I'm not sure if she was someone he regularly saw or if it was just that night. She survived. Story 8. My great-grandpa went absent without leave from the British Royal Navy and stole a Canadian's identity to come to the United States. Story 9. I always knew that my mother's brother drowned while scuba diving in Mexico when he was 21. My parents had always told us he was there with a friend, but they never told us that friend was my dad and that he tried to pull him out of the current but couldn't. As he was getting pulled under, he begged my dad to take care of my mother. My dad had to drive home alone from Mexico to Canada and then tell his future in-laws what happened. Story 10. The motorcycle I bought with my own money at the age of 17 didn't stop working on its own. My dad secretly pulled some wires out, so it wouldn't work anymore. I found out many years later when my brother told me. Story 11. No joke. My grandfather accidentally injured himself and almost lost his penis while trying to masturbate with a vacuum cleaner. It's a strange thing to discover in your 20s. For clarity, I want to note that this incident happened after he became a grandfather and had finished having children. Took place when I was a teenager about 30 years ago. Story 12. I found out I was adopted at 13 when I accidentally discovered a document with my last name listed differently. That was surprising. I didn't realize I would receive so many comments. I thought this would get buried. I posted a longer comment below with more context. Story 13. My grandfather suffered severe post-traumatic stress disorder from serving in World War II, and the lovely old man I knew was actually difficult to live with for my mother and her siblings. I only learned years after his death that he basically lived on stimulants and depressants, Valium to sleep at night and amphetamines during the day. Story 14. I learned a few weeks ago that my grandmother, who is white, was engaged to a Japanese man in California in the early 1940s. When America entered World War II, he was rounded up and deported. She tried to follow him, but her parents prevented her from doing so. How she ended up marrying my racist grandfather and moving to the mountains of West Virginia is something no one seems to know. However, this is why she was insistent on teaching my mother and siblings that racism was wrong and supporting the civil rights movement by donating her side hustle money to organizations that promoted desegregation and diversity. It wasn't a secret. Rather, my mother likely thought she had shared this with us. Story 15. My grandparents were deceived out of valuable land in West Virginia that was rich in minerals. A religious group convinced them to donate it in order to attain salvation. Story 16. My mom tried to end things with my dad a week before their wedding, but my grandfather pressured her into going through with the marriage since they had already paid for everything. This explained a lot, but I didn't learn this until I was about 22. Story 17. My father has tried to be in our lives several times, even buying me my first Xbox and PlayStation. My mother had a different perspective for 19 years of my life. Story 18. I don't know if shocked is the right word, but my dad never told us that my grandfather emigrated from Italy because he was running from the law after shooting someone. My aunt, my dad's sister, informed us of this after my dad passed away. It's not particularly surprising because every story about my grandfather portrayed him as difficult and unpleasant. He died before I was born, so I was spared the experience of knowing him. None of my cousins who met him had a favorable opinion of him. Story 19. My grandmother was not a widow as I had always been told. In fact, my father was the illegitimate son of a local musician and my grandmother. It may not seem like a big deal today, but it must have been hard for my father, who was born in the 1960s. Story 20. I discovered a little over a year ago that my mother briefly lost custody of me when I was a baby because she couldn't stop going out to bars and drinking excessively. Story 21. My grandmother cheated on my grandfather while he was deployed in the military, and they gave the baby to my grandfather's brother and his wife to adopt because they had fertility issues. This was a family secret for many years that my grandmother decided to disclose to her son at his sister's wedding. My uncle described the close relationship he had with his cousin and said it made more sense once he learned they were brothers. She never disclosed his birth father, even when he was dealing with health issues and wanted an accurate health history. He eventually died of cancer. My uncle shared this with me the weekend of my grandfather's funeral. My grandmother had passed several years earlier, and apparently all my aunts are in denial about it. So, my devout Catholic grandmother had a secret love child. Story 22. My first husband became a father with another woman while he was engaged to me. I found out when his child contacted me through an ancestry service. There are other surprises discovered through this ancestry service. My ex-father-in-law had 5 wives, not 3, and he had 8 children, not 7. My current father-in-law, now deceased, was on the Federal Bureau of Investigation's most wanted list in 1935. He was captured and spent time in prison. An ex-brother-in-law had a daughter whom he put up for adoption. I found out when she contacted me. Story 23. Uncle Carl was often talked about as an outlaw in a negative light. I don't even remember what was said. I was so young, I just know he wasn't liked. He wasn't my uncle. He was Uncle Charlie's boyfriend. I guess he was bad-mouthed for being gay in a devout Catholic family. This was the 1970s. Story 24. My older sister was not born prematurely. and my parents did not elope as romantically as I had thought. Story 25. I was in college when I discovered that I was essentially the reason my mother dropped out of college and my parents got married. They are still together 58 years later. The thing is, it wasn't a secret. I was just too naive to realize it. I was bored in church and looking at dates in the family Bible when I saw their wedding date. I tried to argue with them that the year was wrong. It had to be the previous year because my birthday was only 6 months after their anniversary. They didn't say a word, just laughed and rolled their eyes. Story 26. My grandmother actively tried to cause my mother to miscarry by inducing stress because she did not want my father to be held back by a family. She believed he could become famous and wealthy. Story 27. My grandfather was killed in a bar when my father was still a toddler. The official story was that he was murdered over a pinball game. It wasn't until recently that my grandmother confessed on her deathbed that my grandfather actually killed someone and buried the body days before his own demise. He was killed in retaliation for a murder he committed. My grandmother kept the secret for almost 65 years. Story 28. A very conservative grandmother had a short, annulled marriage that ended abruptly when she was handed a hairbrush and asked to provide a spanking on her wedding night. This occurred over 100 years ago. Story 29. My mother gave my inheritance from her mother to her friend to pay off her debt. This meant I couldn't attend the university I wanted to. My father informed me of this just before he passed away, as he wanted me to know. Story 30. The trust fund my grandparents set up for the family would have fully covered all expenses for college or trade school for all of us grandchildren. Our parents never told us because it would have left them with less money, and this was after it had already paid for a house for them outright. We only found out about it a decade after they emptied it. Now they wonder why none of us have the resources to help them in their old age and barely talk to them. I don't know, maybe if they hadn't limited our educational opportunities and pushed us out on our own, they would have established and grateful doctors, lawyers, and engineers to support them instead of a group of late bloomers who had to build their security from scratch. Story 31. A cousin I grew up with was actually a sibling. Our mother still refuses to be honest with the family. Story 32. I found out my grandfather was a former KGB agent and assassinated at least 3 people in his life, with confirmed kills of European politicians, former military generals, and opposition leaders. That was shocking, and we still don't talk about it. Both great-grandfathers served in World War II and survived prisoner of war camps. Rest in peace. Story 33. It wasn't really a secret, but it never came up in conversation while I was growing up. My paternal grandfather kidnapped my grandmother and locked her in his bedroom for months, essentially forcing her to be his wife. Both of them died long before I was born, and I'm told she grew to love him, but I'm pretty sure that was just a way to cope with what was done to her. My siblings met her and said she was nurturing and loving towards all her grandchildren. She had 12 children. I weep for what my female ancestors had to endure. Story 34. I shocked my sister when I told her about the affair our grandmother had for over 20 years after our grandfather passed away. Story 35. My aunt, who is my dad's sister, always seemed a little off and strange. I learned that she was a product of my grandmother being raped by her brother. That was a difficult truth to accept. Story 36. My last name was adopted by my grandfather when he was young and has no genetic connection to anyone in our family. Story 37. I had a grandmother on my mother's side who was alive. I didn't know it until we attended her funeral in my mid-30s. It was the funniest funeral I have ever been to. My mother's family is very white and comes from Idaho, while my father's family is from Missouri. We are quite rural. So what is the appropriate funeral music to play? Native American war chants. My dad and all of us kids were chuckling, and my mom was scolding us. It was a memorable experience. Story 38. My uncle killed a man with a pair of scissors after the man laughed at him for being in hard times at a pawn shop. He is not blood related, but I felt bad my cousin had to deal with his father being a murderer. Sadly, my cousin overdosed a couple of years ago. It's a pretty tragic branch of the family tree. Another branch. My great-uncle was killed in the war, his son drowned in a pool, his wife drowned in a hot tub, and the child my great-aunt had after her husband passed away died in a carbon monoxide accident. Tragedy seems to follow some people around. Story 39. I found out through school gossip that I might have siblings I didn't know about. I don't dare to ask because it might break my family apart, but I did put my DNA online, so it's only a matter of time. Story 40. Everyone in my mother's family was aware that their father was a predator and a molester. His wife knew and did nothing, as divorce was frowned upon. This same woman criticizes me for leaving my manipulative first husband, for whom I was essentially a teenage trophy. Everyone knew, yet they treat the girls in the family affected by the trauma like outcasts. Story 41. My very judgmental paternal grandparents, who were deeply Catholic, looked down on my maternal family because we had divorced individuals and one single young mother. They were in a second marriage, as my paternal grandfather walked out on his first wife and 5 children. I only found out years later, after everyone had been deceased for decades, through a random encounter on Facebook with a nephew from that first family. Story 42. My mom wasn't sick or disabled. She simply didn't want to work but craved the attention associated with being disabled. It reflects textbook Munchausen syndrome. Story 43. My great-aunt, born in the 1930s, was a perfect housewife and stay-at-home mother. She never drank or smoked, decorated beautiful wedding cakes, and sewed wedding dresses. After her death, it finally came out that she had smoked throughout her adult life and managed to hide it from her children, nieces, nephews, and friends, except for her husband, who controlled the finances. Had she admitted to smoking all her life, none of us would have been shocked. However, she was always surrounded by children and grandchildren, so she must have been quite skilled at sneaking off. Story 44. A cousin I grew up with has been a sex worker since she was in her early 20s. She is 56 now. Several older family members knew and kept it secret until about 5 years ago. I was shocked, more so because this poor lady has faced significant challenges in her appearance. Despite this, she has done very well. Her husband and kids live a pretty lavish lifestyle. She has been married for over 15 years and has 2 children. Yes, her husband knows all about it. He used to be one of her clients. Story 45. I have been with my now wife for 20 years. Early in our relationship, I learned that some kind of big family secret existed on her mother's side, but the specifics were not shared with me. One day, maybe a decade later, I forget how it came up, but I finally became privy to it. It turns out one of my wife's cousins, who is now around 50 years old, has a father who is not who she thinks it is. Not in a was adopted kind of way. My wife's aunt, who is the mother of the cousin in question, got pregnant from an affair back in the day, and everybody decided it was best to let this person believe their biological father is someone else. Even more surprising, the actual father still lives just a couple of streets away. Story 46. My brother is actually my half-brother. In fairness to my family, they never hid it from me. They just didn't like talking about it. As a child, I was oblivious. It wasn't until my aunt saw the look on my face at Christmas that they realized they forgot to discuss it with me. Story 47. My very strange aunt, who never left home and whom we were encouraged to look down on and joke about, was likely sexually assaulted as a teenager, which may explain why she struggled to become an independent adult. My mother once planned to make an anonymous call to report a bomb threat on an airline to prevent her thieving brother from leaving the country with the money he stole from my father, my uncles, and various other people he had conned. Story 48. My whole family knew about my autistic tendencies but raised me to think I was lazy, immoral, and choosing to ruin my own life and everyone else's simply because I was too smart to be autistic. I suffered for my entire life until I had a child of my own and finally received a diagnosis. I cannot look at my child and understand how the adults in my life treated me the way they did. Story 49. When I was growing up, my mom claimed to be allergic to dogs. We had a beautiful black Labrador that lived in the backyard, for which my dad built a well-insulated doghouse. I was about 33 at the time when my mom texted us, my brothers and me, that they had adopted a beautiful senior Akita mix, pictures and all. My brothers and I were completely shocked. My dad told us it was our mother's idea, and we were astonished, asking what happened to the allergy she had. I was frustrated that our family dog never got to come inside, even though she thoroughly enjoyed our backyard. Story 50. Not exactly a family secret, but I found out a local grocery store owner was a known pedophile, with teenage boys as victims. My father suggested that my teenage son apply for a job there because it was local and he wouldn't have to drive far. My son found a job elsewhere. I learned about the store owner's history after he died and could hardly believe it. I called my parents, who both knew his past and still thought my son, their grandson, should work for a pedophile. I was beyond angry. Their excuse was that he wouldn't have bothered my son because he knew our son came from a good middle-class family. He only targeted poor kids who needed the job badly enough to tolerate the abuse. It makes me sick to think he was considered a good guy. Story 51. I have a first cousin who was adopted. My family is incredibly close. Cousins are like brothers and sisters. My aunt became pregnant 2 years before I was born in the 1970s. She already had one child, my female cousin. We don't know and never found out who the father was, but we think he was a married man whom she met at work who abandoned her. She hid the pregnancy until the day she gave birth, running to her aunt's house to confess. It was a boy. She named him Paul. She had him adopted and wouldn't let the family see him at all. It broke my grandfather's heart. No one ever talked about it again. In the 1980s, a news article was published about the death of a teenager named Paul. They all assumed it was him and that he was dead. Still, no one said anything. In the late 1990s, we received a call from someone looking for old addresses of his birth mother, my aunt. He was very much alive with a son of his own. My female cousin had to learn that she had a brother sitting in my grandfather's garden over a tense cup of tea conversation. The general response from all the cousins was, "What the actual?" Anyway, he is now part of every family function and is a nice guy. Story 52. I inadvertently found out I was adopted at 16. Later in life, I contacted the agency through which I was adopted and learned that I have a half-sister who didn't want any contact with me. Years passed, and a neighbor gave me an ancestry account. Submitting my DNA revealed cousins that I subsequently contacted. One of the cousins asked if I wanted to reach out to my sister, and I said yes. When I told my sister that the adoption agency said she didn't want any contact, she told me, "I've been looking for you for 35 years. Story 53. A secret that shocked everyone was that after years of being the model South Asian family, it was revealed that my parents' child-rearing superpower was that everyone was neurodivergent. Therefore, from the beginning, I was raised unconventionally because my parents refused to follow harmful generational norms. This revelation came when I, the eldest child, went to university and had to pass a psychological evaluation for working at a lab with children while studying psychology and neuroscience. The next day, I received an email from the psychiatrist's office asking if I wanted to follow up. I did, and then I forwarded the information to my parents. My mom called a family meeting, and we all sat down to discuss what was going on with all of us to varying degrees. I have a few conditions, my sister has one, and my grandmother has the most. It truly was a melting pot of undiagnosed conditions. Drama entered the scene when considering South Asian attitudes toward mental health, especially neurocognitive conditions, which are often seen as a defect or a sign of low intelligence. Moreover, my parents have a playful nature and never miss a chance to mess with someone. This has resulted in my parents responding to relatives who compare children by saying things like, "Oh, that must have been the autism," because they are tired of justifying why hitting children is not acceptable. Now we have a highly conservative extended family urging children to pursue an autism diagnosis, believing it is some kind of secret academic advantage. The same people who once thought it brought shame to the family are now chasing it because they view my parents as the ideal family model, with a doctor and an engineer and successful kids. I don't know how to adequately convey the drama this caused to someone who didn't grow up hearing years of ableist nonsense. But trust me, it was hilarious. Story 54. Back in the 1980s, I had a great aunt whom everyone believed had divorced her husband in her 30s. They only discovered that she had not when she was 96 and went to finalize her last will. It turned out he was still alive, and if he outlived her, he would be eligible for part of her assets. She started proceedings immediately because she was determined not to let him receive anything of hers. I love the women I come from. Story 55. So many in our family are wild. The Germans invaded our country during World War II. My great-grandfather, then a teenager, decided with two of his friends, one male and one female, that they were going to kill a Nazi. My great-great-grandmother, the mother of my great-grandfather, ran a bed and breakfast. They invited a Nazi into the house, promising him a bed, while the female friend pretended to be a prostitute. They lured him into the basement, knocked him out, killed him, and threw him in a river. My great-grandfather later married my great-grandmother, but he was a drunk tyrant. One day, his wife had enough. She boiled some water, and when he came home in the middle of the night, she threw it over him. He ended up in the Christmas tree, and then she put him outside in the freezing cold, telling him not to come back. They divorced. My grandfather's sister had an affair. Her husband was a truck driver, and one day he came home to find that everything, including his wife and furniture, was gone. He received a call from a female friend of theirs, saying her husband had run off with his wife. Usually, this man is a saint, very patient and kind, but he lost it. After a couple of days, the affair ended. He went to his mother-in-law's house, where he found his ex-wife and stabbed her in the face 11 times before my great-grandmother knocked him out with one of her frying pans. He received a 6-month sentence, came out, and they remarried, living happily ever after without any violence or incidents. They had a parrot. Her husband tried to make the parrot attack his wife, but he never succeeded. The parrot only repeated what his wife said. This is only my grandfather's side of my mother's family. My grandmother's side has some wild stories too. Then there is my father's side. But I would have to write a book for that. Story 56. My grandpa, my mother's father, robbed banks in the early 1920s in South Dakota and Nebraska. Both states wanted to charge him, but South Dakota won that fight. He was sentenced to about 10 years. A few weeks before his release, he smashed a chair over the prison warden's head, stole his keys and car, and drove to his parents' house in Illinois. The police picked him up the next morning. He served the rest of his sentence plus some additional time. He had a missing leg that I always thought he lost in a war. I asked my dad what happened to his leg. My dad said, he got so tired of messing up that he jumped off a bridge and messed that up too. I found out the story through ancestry records and newspaper archives. Story 57. My mom had a second sister who disappeared. I know she is alive and out there somewhere and has children. One day I hope to meet my cousins. Story 58. Grandpa was a serial offender with his daughters. Then, when my grandma died, he had a child with the babysitter, and I have an uncle out there. Story 59. My dad has a brother he never met. His father cheated on his mother during the Korean War and left her for a while. He had a child with her before returning to my grandmother with him, his brother, and his sister. They later had my other aunt and uncle, making a total of 5 children, including this other uncle. He had no contact with him ever. My grandmother and grandfather apparently met him once when he was an adult before my grandfather died. However, my dad knew nothing about him. He only admitted to me his existence because I did DNA testing. He knew it would come up. My dad was not a good father. He essentially walked away from my sister and me when we were 2 and 3 years old. I have always wondered how someone can just leave and not care about their child. But apparently it's genetic because his father did it too. I would be devastated if I didn't see my kids. They are the reason I breathe. I am nothing like him. Story 60. I only realized in my late teens that my mom had been a high-functioning alcoholic my entire life. She was incredibly talkative, popular, lovely, and brave, but also very lonely and insecure. She coped through many romances, drinking, and smoking. Once I understood that, everything clicked together. From ages 7 to 12, I remember laughing at her silly requests and helping her to bed because she was so tired that she fell asleep on the couch. My brother and I would put ourselves to bed, often leaving lights on in the house because it was scary with them off. She was always puzzled by this in the morning. I had the worst time waking up to catch the bus and go to school because I was so tired from the night before. Several times a week, neighbors would come to our house and drink on the deck with my mom for hours while my brother and I played inside. The number of wine bottles in the fridge at all times suddenly made sense. Sometimes my mom would pick me up from school with a large soft drink in her car and tell me not to drink from it. One time I did, and she was horrified when I said her tea tasted funny. Turned out it was full of white wine. Her sociability and how she would bring home random people from airports and the grocery store who would stay in our lives until one day they just disappeared. Finally, she married her drinking partner, an abusive man who I'm relieved to say is no longer alive. The fights they had, the things he said to me when he thought no one was watching, and the way he drove with an open glass of scotch in the car will always remain etched in my memory. She died when I was 15 from breast cancer, having stopped drinking the year before. I believe that if she had lived, she would have left my stepfather and remained sober, but who really knows? She'd been drinking since she was 15 and discovered she could mix liquor into slushies. Story 61. I only have 4 uncles and aunts because my grandfather cheated on my grandmother and gave her a virus that required her to have a hysterectomy. I never looked at my grandpa the same way. Story 62. All my youth, carrot and turnip mashed potatoes were called surprise potatoes. At some point, all the kids in my family figured we were the only ones who called them that. Our parents told us they would explain it when we became adults. Well, when we became adults, we finally got the explanation. My big sister hated the carrot and turnip mashed potatoes when she was young. At some point, my parents decided to serve the same dish but called it surprise potatoes. Suddenly, it became the best dish in the world. So yes, they kept it a secret. They pulled a fast one on my sister before revealing the whole story when we could use the same trick on our kids. Story 63. My grandmother attempted to gain conservatorship over my mother while she was pregnant with me. The purpose was to pressure my mother into having an abortion because she wanted to avoid the stigma of my mother having a child out of wedlock. Story 64. During Prohibition, my great-aunt burned down the house once and the barn a second time. She had a still and was supplying half the county. Story 65. My uncle is 20 years younger than my aunt and was actually my aunt's son's best friend. They started having an affair when he was 18 and have stayed together. They are still married today. It was very strange for the entire family, especially for my cousin, whose best friend turned into his stepfather. I'm not sure if it's really a secret. It's just that no one ever talked about it because it made everyone uncomfortable. Story 66. My sister and I have different fathers and were born in another country to our mother. She relocated back to the United States with us, and our stepfather, my sister's father, was supposed to come. We were given one excuse after another that was forcing our family apart. After 5 years, my mother decided to divorce him because he was having an affair. This situation was already complicated. But years later, after my mother passed away, I found out the truth while looking through her documents in my 30s. He had been barred from entering the United States for molesting a young girl in another country. I found many copies of letters pleading his case from her. This changed everything in how I viewed my mother. I will never understand how a mother of young daughters could fight so hard to get a known molester to join her family. Story 67. My great-grandfather was a high-ranking lawyer for the German Nazi Party and sent my grandfather and his brother to a boarding school for them to advance their careers and become loyal supporters. My grandfather's brother died on the Eastern Front. My grandfather hated everything about it. He never spoke to his father again and strongly opposed Hitler. After the war, my great-grandfather continued his career in the legal system. He became very wealthy, and when he died, my grandfather rejected the inheritance, stating, "I don't want to live off the money from an awful person." Story 68. My grandma often engaged in relationships for personal gain, even at 60 when she was involved with her neighbor's husband to get assistance with renovations. Story 69. My grandmother was kidnapped by the Yakuza. In post-World War II Japan, she was of the right age, and they tattooed her and made her work in clubs entertaining. My grandfather, who was difficult, saved her. He met her, decided to marry her, returned to the United States after his duty, and went back to Japan to get her. I only discovered this after my grandmother passed away. It turns out my grandfather was difficult but had a kind heart. Story 70. My grandpa has a sister, not just a brother. It turns out Aunt Julie was ostracized by the family for spending too much time with her roommate. I learned about this in the 2010s, and the older family members refused to acknowledge her sexuality. I still haven't met her and don't know how to contact her, if she's even still around. Story 71. My great-grandmother disappeared one night when my grandmother was around 11 and never came back. Several years ago, after extensive research, we discovered she had run off with someone and was buried in another city. I still cannot understand how someone would leave their children and never return. Story 72. My future wife is on the autism spectrum. She wasn't informed until she was 19 years old. The more we interacted and learned about each other, the more she believes I may also be on the spectrum. 2 weeks ago, we had lunch with my parents, and my mom casually mentioned that I didn't speak until I was 3 years old. I am now 31. Story 73. Throughout my childhood, my grandfather was always critical of us. Our hair was too long, we weren't respectful, and he called us delinquents. We were just normal kids in the 1970s, but he constantly criticized us. He was seen as a paragon of virtue because he didn't drink alcohol. Fast forward a few decades, and with access to public records, I discovered that he got my grandmother pregnant, and they had to marry in the 1920s. How hypocritical. Story 74. After my divorced dad married again, his ex-wife asked if she could be married to him as his second wife at the same time. Yes, he is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His ex-wife was not. He said no. She married someone else a couple of years later. Story 75. I found out at 26 that my grandma has been HIV positive for over 20 years. That doesn't bother me at all. I just thought it was strange that everyone except me knew, including my little brother. Story 76. My mother concealed her second husband's death as a heart attack to secure a significant payout. In reality, he overdosed and was discovered by her and my uncle with a needle still in his arm. There's more, and it's worse. He assaulted a 10-year-old girl in the family, and my mother and grandmother were aware of it but kept it hidden from the family. When the child's diary was discovered, they photocopied those pages and claimed the child was living in a wild fantasy, sending her to live with other family members. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.